of Dr. Liz Chen presenting to us. Dr. Chen is the Design Thinking Lead at Innovate Carolina, and she's an assistant professor in the Department of Health Behavior at the UNC Gilling School of Global Health. Dr. Chen is really an expert on human-centered design. She's done a huge amount of work, both related to teaching and research on human-centered design, and we are just delighted to have her join us today. So without further ado, I should say, everyone, please mute yourself. This is a very well-attended meeting, and there will certainly be room for chat questions and I'm sure participatory components. So without further ado, over to you, Liz.
Thanks, Joe. All right, welcome everyone. I know that some resources were sent ahead of time, so hopefully you had a chance to watch the quick video or just skim the articles that were sent. If not, they are appended again at the end of this presentation with other resources for you to check out. So like Joe mentioned, I am Liz Chen. I serve as Design Thinking Lead at Innovate Carolina, so UNC's Office for Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and Economic Development. And I spend a lot of my time working with faculty, postdocs, students, and staff, training them in human-centered design methods for creative problem solving. So I'm here today to work with you all and share some of the methods that I think will be most easily integrated into all of your future work. With regards to objectives, at the end of our time together, it's my hope that all of you will be able to describe the human-centered design process, its associated mindsets, and the tools that we give you. Differentiate between a human-centered design and traditional problem-solving approaches, and then come away with at least 2 or 3 human-centered design methods that you could integrate into your own work. And as a reminder, PDF versions of the slides are available and will be sent to you. And if you have questions as we go, feel free to type them into the chat or unmute yourself. I will do my best to go through and manage the chat as we progress with content. So for the agenda, as was sent out, we will go through an introduction to human-centered design, and then I will give you all concrete tools and the inspiration and ideation methods that you all can integrate into your future work. I will end with additional resources and peer-reviewed literature so that you can go through and read up on your own, and then host Q&A at the very end. So we will dive right into Introduction to Human-Centered Design. What is it? Well, it's a creative problem-solving approach and innovation approach that starts with the people you're designing for and with, and ends with new solutions that are tailor-made to suit their needs. And so it seems so simple, although many of the structures and processes and approaches that we use in the work that we do sometimes doesn't reflect or align with these methods and approaches. So we like to say that human-centered design is a set of 3 things. So first, it's a set of mindsets. We'll cover that in the next slide. It's a method and a process that's actually repeatable, so it's easy to teach, easy to learn. And then it's a set of tools or activities that you can do alongside the other methods and approaches that you already use. And the picture of the ice cream here is just to remind us that there are different flavors of human-centered design or relatedly design thinking out there. And so popular ones include IDEO, the design firm based in San Francisco, Stanford's D School, and then MIT has their own version as well. And if you look across all of these different versions of design thinking, human-centered design, they all really boil down to a focus in these 3 criteria for innovation. And so we like these overlapping circles. When you are trying to create an innovation, you are looking at the intersection of desirability, feasibility, and viability. So does the desirability piece, how much do people want and need this particular solution? How do they already solve this in their everyday life? How much do they care about this challenge or problem? Next is feasibility. So do we have the technology that we need to solve this problem? Do we have the money, the human resources? All good questions. And then lastly, the viability. So once you've dreamed up and worked with community members to develop a desirable and feasible solution, great. You might have had some initial grant funding, seed funding to start it up. How viable is it though in the real world market? Can it stand on its own after money, especially in the initial phases, goes away? So again, innovation is the sweet spot of these three criteria. And so design thinking and human-centered design are great because they really coach us through thinking about each one of these different key areas. So where did human-centered design evolve from? It is not new. And so again, some of the bigger players in this space include IDEO. This frog in the picture is a design consultancy called Frog, and then Stanford's D School. We're very well known for these methods and approaches. We do know that human-centered design did evolve from computer science, visual design, architecture, and business. And it's been used faithfully to create a variety of different products. And so it's easy for us to think about this in terms of everyday products that we might have seen and even used ourselves. So the companies that put forth Palm Pilots, Oral-B toothbrushes, Apple's computer mouse, and then Fitbit are all companies that have embraced human-centered design approaches and made sure that they've understood the wants and needs of their customers in order to develop many ideas to test with real people before settling on the ones that they take to market. And it's not just hard, like tangible products that you can make with design thinking and human-centered design. You can also craft services, interventions, and policies. And so there have been a lot of great examples. And so here on the screen, we'll walk through just three quick ones. So Keep the Change from Bank of America, LA County, and redesigning the way that they have voters vote at the polls at election time, and then Spotify. So with regards to Bank of America, it's a large bank here in the US based in Charlotte, North Carolina. And their execs realized years ago that many of their customers came into the bank to open accounts because they really wanted to start saving money. However, when the bank actually looked at the behaviors of their customers, they realized that their customers weren't really being very proactive with regards to saving money. And so after going through a couple rounds of human-centered design research, they developed the Keep the Change program, in which every time a customer at Bank of America opens a checking account, they automatically open a free savings account. And every time they swipe the debit card associated with the checking account, it would round up to the nearest dollar and dump that difference into the savings account on the Bank of America side. So if you bought a latte for $3.75, the debit card would pay for that, and then the bank would automatically move 25 cents over to the savings account so that customers were then passively saving. So this was a very popular program that was developed through human-centered design. Similarly, LA County, gearing up especially for the 2016 and 2020 elections, realized that members in their county spoke over 100 different languages and had a variety of different needs when going to the polls to vote for local and national elections. And so they worked with the people of LA to redesign what voting booths look like at key sites. And so here's a sample of what they came up with. And then for those of you who have access to Spotify and use it, it's a music streaming service. And again, this was a service that was developed through a human-centered design process. So bird's eye view, what does the process actually look like? At the most basic level, it is 3 phases, and it looks very nice and neat and linear on this page. And so the 3 main phases are broken into inspiration, ideation, and implementation. And so the first phase of inspiration focuses on understanding people. And so you have a design challenge, you might have a problem statement that you're working on, and instead of immediately jumping forward into coming up with solutions, we sit in inspiration for a while and better understand the context and the people. So oftentimes we sit here and ask, is the problem that we're chasing right now, is that the actual problem or challenge that we should be focused on? How do we collect information from real people? Is it through interviews? What other methods can we use? And how do we stay human-centered? So instead of leading with data sets or previous studies, how do we really understand the needs of real people and interact with real people before moving forward? Next, we go into ideation. So once you've refined the problem statement or challenge, we're gonna start coming up with lots of different ideas. So not just one, and then rapidly testing those ideas with real people. So not just in the lab or not just in our heads, but with real people. And then only after phases in ideation do we head into an implementation phase where we have 1, 2, or 3 ideas that we're really trying to launch in the market to better understand whether it's really meeting people's needs, whether it's feasible in the long run, and the last piece about viability. Can this sustain in the market on its own? And at the image below, you can see that it ebbs and flows between divergent thinking and convergent thinking. So we like design thinking because it really explicitly differentiates between the two. Divergent thinking is collecting a lot of information, exploring a lot of possibilities, so going broad. And then converging is the opposite, making decisions and whittling down. And it's only when you go in between and back and forth these two processes do you follow the design thinking process and truly reach something that is innovative. Okay, and we won't have time today to talk about each and every one of these mindsets, but wanted to make sure that for those of you who are coming into human-centered design new, that these are at least flagged for you. And so in addition to teaching the process and the discrete methods, we really believe that those who learn and apply design thinking and human-centered design truly embody shifts in mindset and the way that they approach not only their project work, but even their lives. And so when we teach this to graduate students and faculty all over campus, these really do highlight the changes that they see once they start embracing human-centered design. And so the big ones here are iterate, 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 the last one. Many of our faculty, because of the structures of funding, often have to commit to an idea upfront. And so what would it look like if instead of committing to one idea, they tested multiple ideas and proposed that to funders? Relatedly, learning from failures. So oftentimes many of us are really risk adverse and afraid of failing. Well, what if we saw failure as a way to learn and an expected part of the process? And then number 2, make it. A lot of us operate in a world virtually right now where we share spreadsheets and manuscript drafts and other forms of data. What if we started to take what was in our head and actually made things that real people could interact with, whether it's part of a tangible solution or a policy or a service, so people can truly react in real time, and that would help collect data for your team to make informed decisions. And so lastly, here are the methods, and we are going to cover a couple with regards to the inspiration and ideation phases. I do highly recommend the online version of IDEO.org's Field Guide to Human-Centered Design. And in it, they go through each of the different methods for the 3 phases, and then they list the steps, the materials, and any tips that they have. And so a lot of the content for the remainder of the presentation is pulled directly from the Field Guide to Human-Centered Design. And then once more, just want to highlight the differences that we see between traditional problem solving and a human-centered design or design thinking approach. So on the left-hand side, that's labeled business thinking. Oftentimes it's really natural for us to be given a problem. And usually with that problem, there's information about the problem, the people that are related to the problem, the context, and then other important tidbits of knowledge. And then once we're handed those problems and that information, oftentimes our teams drive towards finding one solution. And that works a lot of the time. It might not work as well, though, as a design thinking approach. And it is really important that the difference here is clear. And so in the right-hand column with the design thinking, human-centered design, you might be given the same inputs at the start with the same data sets, the same access to communities. And instead of marching forward to one single solution, design thinking forces you to go backwards to do some abductive thinking to further reflect and understand about the population and the context. And then after you've done that, you add additional lessons learned with the open circles under the problem. So then as you move forward to solution generation, you're better informed. And instead of just driving towards one solution, you actually can drive towards testing multiple solutions. So you're not putting all of your eggs in one basket. So overall, why focus on building design thinking or human-centered design skills? Generally, we want participants to develop a deep understanding of the problem before solution generation and separating those two processes. We want participants to focus on developing solutions that meet real human needs, not what we as researchers or experts assume are the real human needs. There's a real importance of going back and actually gathering that information. We want participants to create space and time to explore multiple ideas through using a prototyping approach. So going through and testing a lot of ideas in low cost and efficient ways to get a lot of information before you commit to one final solution. And then emphasize meaningful diversity and collaboration. So not just looking at people based on their disciplines on your design teams or research teams, or just their geographic region, but looking at their lived experiences and involving folks who you're designing with onto your design team so that that set of experiences and that voice is truly represented and has decision-making power. So pause here. I know it was a lot of information to level set. And so at this moment, it would be great if folks could type into the chat to share what about design thinking and human-centered design excites you the most. And I will wait a minute to see what folks jot down, and then we can review it for a little bit before we keep going. All right, as folks continue to write, I'm just going to elevate a couple. And so empathy and human-centeredness come up time and time again. We have mentions of it being a more democratic approach and being open to multiple ideas, understanding all stakeholders, learning from previous mistakes, and the synergy with participation. Great. And so as we move forward, we're now going to dive into the methods. And again, IDEO.org, FROG, Stanford Z School, all of these different design thinking hubs have really great free resources, some of which I've appended at the end. And so these are not the only methods in these phases that I'm offering today. I've curated a list of ones that I think would be most easily and readily applicable to a wide swath of projects. And so look forward to hearing your feedback about how you all might integrate this directly into your professional work and even your personal lives. So inspiration. The purpose again of that first inspiration phase is to learn directly from people you're designing with and for as you immerse yourself in their lives and come to deeply understand their needs. Oftentimes when we are handed a problem to work on, it's easy to distance ourselves from the intended audiences because we're reading about them in peer-reviewed papers or study protocols or data sets. Human-centered design really impresses upon us the importance of getting out there into the field and conducting new field research, market research every time you start a new project. And so, as we were talking about earlier with regards to diversity and making sure that you have a well-rounded team, it's also really important that as you pick participants to engage with during the design thinking process, whether it's for a survey, whether it's for qualitative interviews, that you consider a wide range of people to engage with and not just those that are easy to access or those that are the most eager. And so this method is a really excellent thought exercise and one that we encourage teams to use at the beginning of projects. It's called extremes and mainstreams. And human-centered design hinges on the premise that an idea that suits extreme users will nearly certainly work for the majority of others. And so if you think about it in terms of a bell curve and a population within this bell curve, if you create solutions that work for everybody on the ends of the bell curve, design thinking and human-centered design posit that you would be able to create something that also works for the people in the middle. And so in order for us to think about recruiting a wide range of people with experiences that are different, it's helpful for us to ask ourselves, what do typical users for the challenge or problem that we're working on think, say, and do? And then relatedly, what do extreme users think, say, and do? And so we offer this template for you all to use. And for my own research, I do adolescent sexual health research. And oftentimes when we think about mainstreams in that category, we think of teens 13 to 17 who have access to a smartphone of their own, who have 1 or 2 social media accounts, who at 13 to 17 may have had 1 or more romantic relationships, and who have thought about sex and pregnancy in their everyday life. And then we have extremes. And so we have folks, teens who may not have cell phones, teens who may not have had romantic relationships, teens who do not want romantic relationships, teens who have self-identified as growing up in very religious households or very conservative households, and teens who are really not comfortable talking about sex, pregnancy, relationships with others. And so this helps us organize our thoughts and jot down some of the assumptions that we have about the different end users, and helps us clarify when we say end user, population, patient for our team, who is it that we are talking about exactly? And if it's multiple groups, help us understand as a team which all the groups are so that you have the same understanding as you move forward in the rest of the project. Next, card sorts are really useful. So many of you are likely familiar with qualitative approaches to doing research, so doing interviews and focus groups. We found over the years that card sorts are a really great way to engage people, whether it's through words or pictures. So it's a quick and easy way to spark conversation about what matters most to the people that you're designing for. And with these cards that you can either print and cut or write and cut, it's really nice that you can have something tangible that folks can move around to either rank, sort, add to the batch of cards, or explain. And so for an example, working with adolescents again around sexual health, we do ask our teens sometimes to think about who they trust most when they have questions about sex and relationships. And so here's a deck of cards with different people, and we ask them to rank from left to right the people they feel most comfortable asking questions when they have concerns about sex and relationships. So for these 2 teens, they said that parents and friends were the go-to people versus coaches and teachers were the least go-to people. And it was helpful to have them manipulate this and touch it and move it, and then probe and ask further questions. Like, what is it about parents, guardians, and friends that makes them different from coaches and teachers? And so again, this is a great fast method for you to integrate into existing protocols that really can yield different information than a traditional interview guide. And then the third inspiration method that we're going to cover includes analogous inspiration. So this is very new for a lot of folks. So how can we isolate elements of an experience, interaction, or product, and then apply them to whatever design challenge that you're working on? So what do you actually want your users to do, and what other contexts do users do this that might be outside of your direct context? How do you want users to feel? And in what other contexts do users feel this? And so one common example of this is Steve Jobs and developing Apple stores. And so once they decided Apple wanted to launch their first set of brick and mortar stores decades ago, with people staffing it, where people would go and test products and then buy them, a member of his team supposedly asked, like, great, like we should do some market research. Let's go to the Best Buy and the Radio Shack down the street for us to gain inspiration, because that's our field. And reportedly, Steve Jobs responded, nope, like they're not doing particularly well. We don't want to repeat what they're doing, repeat their mistakes. Like, what I really want to explore is the luxury hotel experience. Like, I want to create a space where people feel really welcomed, that they're getting a guided individual experience like you would with a concierge at the front desk. We want them to feel like there's a lot of space and that the products that they're viewing are high end. And so he took an initial team to explore several different high-end hotels. And again, it's a different way of thinking. And so he thought about creating a new store, but likened it to high-end hotels. And for the work that I'm talking about for this talk with regards to sexual health, we wanted to create a digital product where teens could explore topics related to sexual health and feel really welcomed. And so that led our team in the bottom picture to go to a hands-on science museum. So we were curious, like, how are physical spaces set up so that young people can discover things on their own? How much direction do they need? Do they like to do it by themselves? Do they like to do it in groups? We generated more questions that helped us really think about that for our digital space. And then we also thought about what we didn't want our digital space to feel like. And so in El Paso, Texas, through conversations with teens, they told us that there's a community center that really does not feel like a community center to them, and they don't feel welcomed. And that felt very sterile, the environment. And so we physically went into that space, and there's a mural here that's from that space. But again, we looked at examples and non-examples to help inform questions that we could ask ourselves to further develop a better understanding of what it is that people want and don't want. And so in this phase, there are a variety of other methods. And so some that IDEO offers include conversation starters. So if you're an interview, and instead of just going with the traditional open-ended interview questions, what would it look like if you started with some more out-of-the-box questions or sentence stems? There's immersion, where we ask research teams to essentially live out experiences with members of the community, peers observing peers, collage, guided tour, again, asking members of the community to walk us through a particular experience or their everyday life so we better understand what they do day in and day out, and then draw it. And again, we will pause here. And so we just covered 3 brief methods. And so extremes and mainstreams, card sorts, and analogous inspiration. So I'm turning it back to you all now, both via chat, or if you would like to raise your hand and unmute yourself, that would be great. How might you integrate these inspiration methods into your future work? So again, take a minute, think about it, and type into the chat. Great. As folks continue to type, it seems like card sorts would be popular to implement. It really is a low tech and fast method to embed into existing data collection methods. And so, yeah, you can pre-supply the items on the cards. You can ask people to fill them out. You can have them, you could do pictures instead of words or photos. And so there's a lot of possibilities there. And then let's see. Yep, a lot of folks are offering other methods that they would use. Oh, and Gaddafi, first time I'm beginning to realize the integration of love and empathy in research. Really fantastic. Great. Okay, and then we are going to go through a couple ideation methods similarly so that you can see some for yourself and then think about how you might integrate it into your work. Again, the purpose of ideation is to identify opportunities for design and to prototype or test possible solutions with real intended users. So again, not an academic exercise or only within your lab, but testing bits and pieces of solutions in the real world. Okay, this is my favorite because so many people use this word and but not in the way that it is originally intended. So method 4 is brainstorming. Like we said earlier, divergent thinking is about creating choices, and it's very different from convergent thinking, which is making choices. Oftentimes, though, we lump them together. Clear brainstorming rules can help generate more creative ideas free of judgment. And that's what we want in a true brainstorm. So I bet that many of us have been in rooms before where we are in a meeting and somebody says, and now we're going to brainstorm and we have this amount of time. And at the end, we're going to pick usually the one or sometimes the 2 or 3 best ideas to move forward. And it's really hard because divergent thinking is one set of skills. Convergent thinking is another set of skills. Mashing them together is really tough. And we do recommend that when you set up brainstorming activities with your team or with intended users, intended audience members, patients, that you give individual brainstorm time separate from group brainstorm time. Because we know that it takes a little while to get the creative juices flowing. And for people who are more introverted, it's going to be hard for them to immediately participate in a group brainstorm. So asking people to do it by themselves first before asking the group is the recommended practice. And IDEO offers rules of brainstorming. And if your team has never had rules to brainstorming, like most, it's great to have a list printed or posted somewhere, and then to practice using it with brainstorm topics that are not related to your work, and then to slowly build the muscle over time to get used to adhering to these rules when it comes to your actual research. So defer judgment of yourself and of others. Oftentimes when I lead workshops like this with faculty, I will give 3 minutes of individual brainstorm time, and many faculty will sit there and quietly think without writing for about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And then at the end, we'll jot down the top 2 or 3 ideas that they've judged as the best. So rule of brainstorming number 1, defer judgment of yourself and others, free write. Encourage wild ideas of yourself and others, build on the ideas of others when you start to share. So this comes from the yes and method and parts of improv. Stay focused on the topic, one conversation at a time, be visual. So drawing diagrams, drawing pictures can be really, really helpful. And this is the big one. In addition to defer judgment, go for quantity over quality. You're only going to get innovative ideas if you consider a larger range of ideas. And even if the ideas you innately know might not be the most feasible, that's okay. Put it out there, and then your team can have a conversation about why certain ideas are less feasible than others. So again, go for quantity here. So related to the sexual health work, we were developing a digital tool related to sexual health among adolescents. And some of our brainstorming with community members, teachers, school leaders, teens, and parents yielded video games, avatars, Snapchat videos, text conversations, scavenger hunts, a version of Pokemon Go, board games, annotated porn. We came up with a lot of ideas and many, many more. And naturally, after whittling it down some through convergent thinking methods, another great method to consider is a co-creation session where you provide materials to stakeholders and ask them to create solutions and then pitch their ideas to you and others. And so it's twofold. You get the ideas that they generate either in hard copy or 3D if you're asking them to manipulate like pipe cleaners and actual made materials. You also get their value propositions or how they pitch a particular solution to other people. So then you can listen and hear what it is that they find most important or most different about this solution compared to something else. And you can pick up on themes. So for us, we ended up knowing that we wanted to create some sort of online app where teens could access and share information about sexual health topics. And so with that framing, we handed over markers and pictures of blank cell phone screens to teens and asked them to dream up what they would find most useful. And here are some snapshots of what they came up with. And again, the important part was them also sharing it back to others in the room, because it was the language that they used that later informed our marketing. So time and time again, teens were saying that they wanted stories instead of facts and figures, and that they wanted to know that they weren't alone. And so those were the messages that we constantly reinforced with the ads and any marketing that we had for this project. And then next comes rapid prototyping. So again, we're not putting all of our eggs in one basket. We are testing lots of different ideas in low cost, fast ways. So this is where you create basic versions of your concepts and share them with stakeholders to collect data from them. So the data can range from impressions, so what we call say data, to behaviors, which we call do data. So what's the cheapest and fastest way to translate your idea into something shareable with the purposes of getting feedback? And so on the right-hand side, we took some of the screens and renderings that teens had made through co-creation sessions, and then we put them in PowerPoint. So we used text boxes and text to create these and then printed them off for our next round of prototyping. And that was very low cost and very fast. Okay, and then the last method that I'm gonna offer to you today is journey mapping. Our journey map allows you to identify and strategize for key moments in the product experience or service you're designing. It can track decisions, behaviors, feelings, etc. And so many of us in health, public health, we're so focused on designing the solution itself. And so what does the intervention look like? What does the actual product look like? What does the policy look like and read like? And we forget that there's a before and there's an after. So people have to hear about your solution in order to find it in the real world. And then after they try it once, what is the experience after? What's that follow-up? What's the end point? And so our journey map really forces research teams to consider the whole set of activities and behaviors before people come to the solution and after people come to the solution. And there's different ways that you can visualize this. So we've included two in this slide deck. And so the first one is Starbucks customer journey map. And what they've done is they've listed out at the bottom the different phases. So they've said that for Starbucks, there is an anticipate phase where you're thinking about going to coffee, excited to go get coffee. And then you enter into a store, you engage with Starbucks staff, you exit, and then you reflect. So those are the different phases or stages. And with that, they identified the touch points. And so where does this happen? How does this happen? So anticipate happens in the office or car. And then when you enter, it's the point in which you're walking in. And so they further clarify the different points where they could potentially interact with customers or offer some other experience. And then they have this chart above where an enriched experience is positive, a poached experience is negative, and they offer different pieces or different factors that could contribute to a positive or negative experience at each one of those different stages. And so if you enter Starbucks, things that might enhance your Starbucks experience include the aroma. You smell it and it smells great. Things that could either enrich or poach your experience is the ambiance. And so if it looks really nice, if it's not super crowded, that might be great. But on the flip side, if it is overcrowded and there are long lines, that might poach your experience. Also, if it's loud and cold, it might detract from your experience. So here's one example of a journey map. On this next page, I've included a customer journey map that maps the experience of shopping for a new car. So this is something that people do, and it is not usually seen as an enjoyable process. And this team has put together their 5 phases where a customer considers the purchase, they explore, they compare options, they test, and then they negotiate. And so they even have time markers built in. And within each of those steps or phases, there are smaller steps and phases. And this particular group also mapped what it looks like the emotional journey at the bottom and provided sample quotes or thoughts of what they think emotional Eric, their persona, is thinking at each one of these phases. So again, different from the journey map before, but another tool to visualize a journey from start to finish and not just the solution in isolation or the desired experience in isolation. And other ideation methods that IDEO covers include create frameworks, design principles, mashups where you take different ideas for seemingly different brainstorms and situations and combine them together. Storyboarding, so related to a journey map, drawing out almost like a cartoon, the customer or patient experience from start to finish so you can visualize it better. Role playing, and then a business model canvas. So it is important before you leave the ideation phase to make sure that you've started to think about the business model or the sustainability model. So again, I will pause here once more and ask you all to think about how you might integrate some of these ideation methods into your own work. We summarize the basics of brainstorming, co-creation session, rapid prototyping, and journey mapping, in addition to offering some of the others from IDEO. It would be great if you all took a minute to type your response in the chat or raise your hand, and I can ask you to unmute for the group. Great. So of the 4 methods that I shared, it doesn't seem like there's one favorite. It seems like there's a pretty even interest in exploring each of the 4, which is great. And hopefully you also consider some of the other methods that we didn't get to today. Okay. And so because we only had an hour today and I want to make sure we have time for questions, I will just close that I really love using human-centered design work and the public health work that I do. And I really enjoy training students and working with other faculty members to consider how might we more meaningfully engage with intended audiences throughout problem definition and solution generation. How might we test multiple iterations of proposed solutions in the real world before settling on one? And then how might we develop interventions in a span of weeks and months instead of months versus years? And we really do see human-centered design methods and approaches as a way to do all of these things. And so additional resources for you to explore on your own. I've linked the digital version of IDEO's field guide, which is free for folks to download as a PDF. Penn Nursing has a really great course that was funded by the Hillman Foundation and developed for everyone to use called Design Thinking for Health. And then Jean Litka offers a free Design Thinking for Innovation Coursera course online that also has homework assignments if you like that. And for those of you who really like or want to learn more and want additional resources, I did put together a list of my favorite academic papers on human-centered design and design thinking. And so this is a snapshot, so not everything, but the highlighted version, and some of these were sent to you all ahead of today. So this is human-centered design and design thinking in health generally. And then for those of you who are interested in how researchers in global health have integrated human-centered design into their own work, I've pulled some case studies and then listed the countries for you. So if it's easier for you to organize and find it this way, hoping that that is helpful. And so at this point, I will end the formal presentation and ask you all to, or invite you all to ask me questions. And here's my contact information. Feel free to email me. I'm at lizcchen@unc.edu, and want to thank you all for your time today and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, Liz. That was wonderful. Really tour de force, fantastic resources and examples. As Liz mentioned, if anyone has questions, feel free to put them into the chat box, and then maybe she can all group them together and she can take a few questions. So while you're thinking, Liz, you've done, I'm going to sort of take the chair's prerogative here and ask you one about, in terms of these different approaches for human-centered design and sort of skills and strategies, is there, if you had to rank like the ones that you've used the most to the least, which of these strategies, like 2 or 3, do you think you've used the most over the last several years? And be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I really think that within inspiration, extremes and mainstreams has been the one that my faculty who are doing research have used the most, because it is a different way of thinking about recruitment. And I think that oftentimes we think about recruitment and diversity for recruitment with regards to demographics, and it forces us to think about behaviors and behaviors and experience more than just demographics. So I really think that, especially for driving towards equitable solutions, going beyond just recruiting diversity with regards to demographics is really important. And then I really think that card sorts, I've elevated that here because it really is a low-tech way to gather different information than a traditional interview or focus group approach, and can be easily embedded into it. And then with regards to the ideation phases, brainstorming and separating divergent and convergent thinking has just helped in my research and also just in my everyday life. Like I ask my husband and I, when we say brainstorm, truly leave the space open to throwing out really creative ideas before we layer on our concerns and constraints. And so those are the three that I think I would elevate just for research, but just for everyday life too.
Thanks, Liz. And that's a great point about brainstorming. I think oftentimes we're crunched for time, and ideas that are half developed or could be a source of inspiration aren't given enough time. We have a question in the chat box about the way low has a question about engaging with stakeholders for brainstorming, co-creation of solutions, and what's the right group size. And I suppose this is sort of like, how do you know you have a quorum, or small group, like is it best to be 2 or 3 people or 10 people, or how do you know what the right size is?
Yeah, I think that a manageable size, so there's a logistical constraint here too. I think that somewhere between 4 and 8 is always a nice number, because you can fit often in one room. Everyone can talk and everyone can hear each other. And if you need to run multiple brainstorming sessions, multiple co-creation sessions to feel like you're getting like enough voices, like you might choose to put all students or all teens in a room together, because if you mix them with people with more power, so parents and teachers, that might be hard. And so just thinking about the power dynamics, and then the logistical pieces about like how many people can fit in a space and really hear and engage with each other is the other part. But I would say 4 to 8 is a good number. And again, you can have multiple brainstorming sessions, multiple co-creation. You don't have to have one big one.
Great. There's another question from Anita about using HCD, using human-centered design in tertiary hospital settings in terms of patients with mental or physical health conditions. Do you think this could human-centered design be applied in that specific context?
Yeah, I really do think that human-centered design can be applied in most contexts. We'd want to think about which methods would be most appropriate for the setting, and who might be the ones who are engaging with the patients. But I think that these methods are meant to be accessible to all, and I really think that a version of them could be used. And so if Anita, if you want to ask specific questions, I'm happy to think through that with you. So just send me an email.
And speaking of which, Melita has a question about what's the hot stuff that you're working on? What human-centered design projects are cooking in your lab or in your world right now? She was interested to hear more.
Yeah, Melita, thank you. I will answer it in 2 ways. So one, just my research portfolio has been shifting of late. And so instead of trying to be known as an adolescent sexual health researcher, with regards to a very narrow topical focus, I'm trying to reframe my portfolio and myself, and rebrand as a human-centered design methodologist, and try to dip my toe into a variety of different projects in the health space that won't pigeonhole me only to adolescent sexual health. And so I have been doing a lot of thinking and research on how to integrate human-centered design with community-based participatory research and implementation science. So a lot of methods work. And then on the ground, I get to spend a lot of time in my design thinking lead role, working on a variety of different projects. And one of the ones that I'm most interested in and enjoy the most is a project called Be Fast here at UNC. And it is working with families in Durham, North Carolina, to make sure that all children have access to screening and are connected to resources, especially if they screen the need, or they're flagged early for autism. And so that is one that we are working deeply with the community, and then also with parents who've experienced these interactions and diagnoses early. And so it's been really great getting to better understand systems and having parents be part of our design team.
We have a bunch more questions in the chat. I'm just going to take one more question from Dr. Nwazuru at Wake Forest. She's asking about during COVID, a lot of human-centered design has been pushed online. Any recommendations for how these principles could work in online environments as opposed to in-person ones?
Yeah, before COVID, a lot of us were thinking about what it could look like to do more of these things online with teams all over the world. And then we were forced to think about this. And I will say that many of these methods translate really well online. And so whether you're using free products like Google Jamboard to do a brainstorm, or just to share information or to co-create, I think that a lot of these naturally translate to these free online whiteboard spaces. And what I really like about that is that it does de-identify a lot of like the ideas. And so if Joe and I were in a room with all of you and we were brainstorming something and I pulled up Google Jamboard and asked you to dump your ideas in there, we wouldn't be able to see whose idea was whose. And so that an anonymity has actually been a perk of doing some of this work online. And I will say that at the beginning of the pandemic, we really did think about who had better, who was online engagement easier for. And so some parents for the BFAST project really liked it because they didn't have to worry about travel or getting childcare coverage for their children. So it was easier for them to engage in human-centered design activities through Zoom. On the flip side, for a different project I was working on for elder care, we had participants who were really frustrated with the online because they're not familiar with Zoom or technology. And when we asked them to brainstorm using sticky notes, like that just wasn't feasible. So I think it's a good question when you think about in-person versus virtual, who will benefit from this mode and who will not, and then use that to inform your decisions.
Great. Well, thank you once again, Liz. And I don't know if do you have time to stay after for a few minutes? I still see a whole bunch of questions in the chat box.
Yeah,
great.
Happy to stay on a few minutes. And then again, I'll put my email in the chat if folks have any other questions they want to send my way.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Chen. This was fantastic. For all of those still on the line, we do have a very brief survey instrument just to help get feedback. This is both for Liz, but then also for our subsequent social innovation training workshops. So please fill that out. The URL is in the chat box. And then our next speakers on July 26th, a week from today, we have Melita and Marvinson, who are going to be presenting on Share What You Saw, an online workshop on storytelling and research dissemination. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great day.
Hi, everyone. I can stay for questions if folks want to elevate the ones that are here already. Okay, not sure who's facilitating this, but I will go back and try to read through the questions again and maybe tackle them in order. Gaddafi, your question, what's the role of HCD research in curbing AMC upsurge and resurgence? I think there might be some connection. What is AMC or AMR? Might be easier for you to unmute if possible, so I don't have to keep scrolling. But if you answer that question, I can try to answer that one.
Antimicrobial resistance.
Oh, yeah, I think I'm not sure of any explicit studies or research teams that are working directly on that, but I think that the human behaviors that are related to the resurgence would benefit from using some human-centered design principles to better understand like what it is that makes humans do the things that we know leads to resurgence. So I haven't seen a study directly on that, but it would make sense to try it. Okay, Lavanji, I'm wondering the most of the qualitative methods, are there any quantitative oriented methods that are useful, or does that go against the principles of HCD? I wouldn't say that it goes against the principles of HCD. I do think that, especially with regards to recruitment, which does inform who fills out and provides quantitative data, that extremes and mainstreams would be incredibly important. And then everything when you are testing multiple ideas is rather quantitative. If you have assumptions that you're testing about change in knowledge or change in behaviors with measurable outcomes, that can all become quant. And Rula, did you use human-centered design for system change? And so not all of the problems that we work on need to be tackled at a systems level, but there are people who are combining systems thinking with human-centered design. And I do think that HCD is great because it forces you to think about the systems, not only like the different stakeholders, but the different systems that impact those stakeholders. And so, yeah, I do think that, and then to better, if you figure out that it's a system that needs to change, I do think that human-centered design is a great way to better understand the system and how do you market the change to decision makers of that system? So like better understanding their needs so that when you pitch to them a solution, it satisfies what they want in addition to what your research team wants. Samuel, in which geographic settings has HCD been tested? How encouraging has the use of HCD been in such settings? It's a great question. And so all over the place in the appendix in the resources section, I did include a lot of examples from Australia, Africa, and maybe one or two in Asia. And it's hard because when you say test, I know that people want the return on investment and want the RCT version of like a study that used this HCD and then a study that didn't. It would just be, I haven't seen a study design like that yet. And I think it would be really hard because it would still be comparing apples to oranges. But I think that the outcomes with regards to implementation and ease of implementation is where people have focused. And I did see a cost, I think I linked it, there's a cost effectiveness article on how an intervention saved money with regards to a host of different factors because it was easily implemented compared to others out there. So I think that we're going to see more return on investment and comparison studies come out as more and more people apply these methods. I still haven't seen great ones, but it is on my to-do list to aggregate the evidence in a paper at some point. And I'm scrolling and scrolling. Luis, where will the recording of the session be available? That's a great question for Joe and Yusha. I think it's typed somewhere here, and I will go back and look for it in a second. And then Luis, I'm not managing this, so I don't have the answer about the diplomas or certifications. I'm not sure there is one. And so it would be good if somebody on the team could answer that. And then otherwise, I just sent you the link that they shared about where all of the workshop recordings and materials can be found. Great. Does anybody else on here have questions that I can answer? Yeah, Antonia, how do you manage the duration of HCD approach, which appears to take much longer time to get to implementation of solutions? It's a great question. I think it looks long because you spend more time in the you have this added inspiration phase and ideation phase, arguably, but because once you get to implementation, you feel really confident about the fit of the solution with the people in the real world, that the implementation of itself takes less time and there's greater uptake. And so you could do a human-centered design approach as fast as like a couple weeks and months, which is oftentimes much faster than any other design or development process. And so like the big consultancies usually charge and work with clients for weeks at a time, not months at a time. So like 6 to 12 weeks for an inspiration ideation phase, and then it's up to the client to seek to do the implementation. So I don't actually think it's longer, which is the appeal of an approach like this. For those of you who are asking about the certificate requirements, Sesh Global has posted the response for that. Okay, any remaining questions that I can answer? Yeah, Louise, it's a good question. A lot of people use them interchangeably, and so some people differentiate the slight nuance between them, but for all intents and purposes and in the research and then like the peer review paper, I search human-centered design and then I search design thinking. Human-centered design is a word, it's like a phrase coined by IDEO, and so more often you will see design thinking. You're welcome. And then Luis, there's also user-centered design or person-centered design. And so I look for all of them when I do my lit searches. Great. Last call for questions. I agree, Luis. It would be nice if there was a standardized mesh term. Does not exist yet, but I would advocate for one in a heartbeat. And then Ernesto is asking for the link. Sesh Global team, can you put the link in again for the eval? I would appreciate it for folks to complete that. It would be really helpful to see how this could be more useful, or what additional trainings folks want. My team does do trainings locally and globally for any who's interested. Jody, with regards to the implementation phase, have you had experience getting stuck with ethics, for instance, with RCTs? Jody, when you say stuck, could you give an example? You might be typing. You can also unmute yourself if that's faster. Yeah, Jody, I haven't had a situation, or I can't come up with an example where you did inspiration ideation well and then got stuck with ethics on the back end of implementation. So ideally, any concerns about ethics or who needs to give permission for a particular solution to exist would have been flagged and considered an inspiration and ideation and not waited to implementation. So I don't think that typically comes up because of all the intentionality behind steps in the first two. But if I come across one, I will flag it. Luis, did you want to provide an example?
Well, yes, I'm actually facing one. I'm doing a piece of research and of development, really, in which we have all the parties involved in developing a platform to look at accessibility to health services. And when we try to present this, that has the engagement and the participation of the users in the design, if the project is presented to people in the health sector, they want to go through an ethics review committee. And it's make a very cumbersome process. But if you're going through the transportation or other engineering side of it, this is their day-to-day work. They always consult end users, and it doesn't have the same kind of stringent requirements just because you're asking people what are their needs, and you're involved in the process of finding the solutions. So I think there's a very many different standards, like with the mesh, that there's different ways of calling the same thing, but also different ways of approaching it. Participatory action research, patient involvement, and so on should not drive things to the process where to the point where you get stuck. And that's what happens when you go through an ethics review committee on the health side.
Yeah, I think for the products that we've had that have had lots of systems and systems with ethics boards, and even here at our institutional review board for human subjects research, we do recommend that our research faculty submit all of the activities that they're planning on doing as a formal research study to get approval before they move forward with all of their activities. And so it's hard when you encounter it in the moment and couldn't plan for it earlier. But I do think that depending on how you plan on using these methods, it likely is human subjects research, and therefore should be subject to IRB approval. And then if the systems that you find require the same, it's hard to know ahead of time what those expectations are. Yeah, Louise, yes. So we design it as a study. And so when we modify as we go, so here's our study, just like we would submit it for qualitative research. Like, here's our plan to engage with community members. Here are the type of people that we are recruiting. This is how we're recruiting. Here are the sample activities. And we are submitting it for this first phase of research for inspiration. And after inspiration, we'll update the methods and submit a modification for the ideation phase. So we don't commit to the solution or have to spell out all of the methods up front, but we, as we go, make updates and then get the approval, reapproval every time. It takes longer, but more and more faculty are doing design thinking work, human-centered design work. And so it seems like IRB is trying to match us in nimbleness. Yeah, so Luis, if you want to talk about how to better like submit IRBs in alignment with human-centered design approaches, I have some lessons learned having coached faculty through that here. Yeah, Jody, same. It's not fun to navigate ethics requirements, but if you do have specific questions, I'd be happy to at least try. And then C on, does it mean 2 IRB approvals are required, 1 pre-study and 1 right before implementation of the idea or product? Yes. So we submit one with our best guess, knowing that things might likely change. We might add an activity here, change the phrasing of this question. But then once the whole study is approved, we then submit modifications with the updated final protocols. And so that has seemed to work really well with our IRB here. And then Louise, some of these developments happen as part of the continuous improvement of process, health systems improvements, et cetera. They're part of a daily operation of a system. Yeah. And there's things that are not within our control. And so we can only plan for and request approval for the things that we know that we need to do that for. And then roadblocks go up and we navigate them as we can. And so I do need to hop off to prep for my 9:30 meeting. But again, for those of you who have follow-up questions and want to ask them, I will type my email into the chat once more and invite you to connect with me. And again, I appreciate all of your time and your questions and hope that we cross paths later again. Great, thank you all.